What's up, everybody? I got two videos that I've been asked to give reactions to. Today, we are going to do the first one, which is why are Marines getting out? Hint, same shit for decades. And we're going to dive right in.
Number one thing I hate the most in the Marine Corps.
What are some of the roadblocks that you're seeing, or why are Marines getting out?
Well, guys, there you go. I gave you the reasons of why I'm now out of the Marine Corps, and let me tell you, one of the best decisions I've ever made.
So if you haven't noticed, the military is running into a slight recruiting problem.
Yeah, so for those of you who aren't on the streets, right, I was a recruiter for a while, and I've talked to a couple of recruiters or former recruiters who were around over the last little bit. One of the main, or there's a few main issues from what I've gathered, and this is not, the military hasn't come out and said this, but this is kind of what I'm gathering. So one is some of the, I don't want to say political stuff, but like the vaccine mandate, right? Traditionally, a lot of the people who join the military are, slightly right of neutral, conservative, Midwest, Texas, Missouri. I mean, California, there's people all over, right? Nationwide. But like a lot of the hub is like Midwest people who want to go serve their country. Well, those are the same demographic that isn't huge on being told they have to get this vaccine. So that's been kind of a stigma, kind of an issue, I think, on one front. Also, that same group may or may not be huge fans politically of the current commander-in-chief, which is, whatever. I mean, that's been the case, kind of ebbs and flows, right, as we go Democrat, Republican, back and forth through the eons. But that, people voice that. I see those comments on my YouTube channel. However, I'll tell you that the commander-in-chief has much less bearing on day-to-day in the military than you would think, day-to-day life, that is. Another big one, and this one's almost comical, and I'm going to do the best to say this without, screwing myself, but they created a system that will pull medical records. So now, if you don't tell your recruiter that you used an inhaler and you go to MEPS, they will be able to see that if you went to a doctor and got prescribed an inhaler, it will pop up. And so that could be for nothing, but now that could be for virtually nothing. So now you have to go get all these documents to prove you don't have asthma, right? So as a recruiter, one of the most frustrating things is when a child or a kid or an applicant brings something up that really isn't a current medical issue, but was something back in the day like that, right? Like I used an inhaler for a little while, and then I was a fat kid and I got in shape, and now I don't need it, right? I had an applicant, I kid you not, I had an applicant who, we ran a 3-mile PFT run, physical fitness test, 3-mile with him, with my recruiter instructor, RI, who was a master sergeant, master guns select, and the kid ran a 15:30. I mean, I don't remember the exact time, but it was under 16 minutes for 3 miles. He ran cross country in college, and he was never able to join the military because when he was a younger child, he had been diagnosed with asthma, and there were no documents stating that diagnosis was gone, and the military wanted him to go get like a $2,000 or $3,000 pulmonary functions test done out of his own pocket to prove he didn't have asthma, despite being a collegiate cross-country runner and running a 16-minute 3-mile, which I have never been able to do in my life, so I would assume that he probably doesn't have asthma, right? So another one's shoulder surgeries. If you have your labrum torn. We had a guy who, sophomore, junior year of high school, he won state as a wrestler in like the 200, 210, 220, whatever range. Had labrum surgery because he tore it in his shoulder. Went back one state senior year after the shoulder surgery and could do 25, 30 pull-ups and was still denied BUMED, Bureau of Medicine, waiver for said shoulder injury, right? So back in the day, and I'm not saying I did this, and I'm not saying any other recruiter has ever done this, but you could kind of talk a kid through and say, hey, look, I know that there may be some things that you have or don't have or think you might have. If it's not for sure something that happened, or it's not like something that affects you at all anymore, like maybe, whatever, right? So the asthma thing, did you really have asthma, or were you like a fat kid who was told you might have asthma? Like, did you use an inhaler? If you weren't prescribed an inhaler, don't bring it up, right? Or if you weren't prescribed Adderall, don't bring up that you talked to somebody about ADD, ADHD, right? Like, if you were never prescribed or diagnosed, then just don't bring it up. Well, now, even if you went in and you talked about it, even without a diagnosis, it's going to pop up. So now it's like, the military kind of opened Pandora's box with this one, because they can't go back and say, oh, well, the reason nobody's qualified to join the military is that for years a lot of people who weren't qualified to join the military were joining, because our requirements are so freaking strict. So recruiters are running into an issue where they might send 10 people up to enlist, and 2 or 3 of them get approved, and the rest all go to this long BUMED process, which not fun. But I digress. Let's see what they say.
Sergeant Major of the Marine Corps comes out and says, we got to retain better, invest better in troops. And I wanted to present to you a staff sergeant still in, a lance corporal who's a year out, and the sergeant major. Let's see if we can figure out how we can retain more and get people more fired up in the Marine Corps. Let's go.
So the Marine Corps is looking to retain and mature its force. Why and how do you plan to do that?
Retaining and maturing the force, not a new concept, quite frankly.
So the Marine Corps historically has been pretty good about getting people to sign up. Not as many challenges as, say, the Army, but make sure to take a look in the description for the Two Gentlemen's channel. And we got the Sergeant Major here. Let's figure out what the problem is. How do we retain more people?
I think what I would offer as an explanation of why it's a big deal now is, number one, as we see the Commandant, and this isn't new to this Commandant, we've always invested a great deal in how we train and educate Marines.
Funding. Oh my gosh, funding is terrible in the Marine Corps Plus. Obviously, for funding, we get the least out of every other branch, so we get the least amount of money to work with.
All right, you heard what the Sergeant Major of the Marine Corps said, this fine young staff sergeant. So funding, that's been a thing since I joined the Marine Corps. We're talking 30 years ago, right? That funding sucked, and we still hear funding. We might as well take funding off the table because we ain't getting it. I mean, you remember the old mop gear, any of you jarheads that spent time at, say, an Air Force base. You go to that dining hall, and you go to the dorm, and you go back to your barracks as a young lance corporal, and you realize it's a little bit different a deal. So the funding ain't going to happen.
We have not had a necessity.
Yeah, he's right. Funding is what it is.
Or a calling to do is retain more of that investment.
You have.
I was tired of being treated like a child.
What we're really talking about is that first term Marine, at the end of the first contract. Our current model lets go intentionally of about 75% of who we recruited just 4 years ago.
Now, why do you think it is that 75% of the guys you trained for maybe a year-ish, they're let go? Do you think they just lose interest in the oorah devil dog stuff? They get the old eat the apple core, if you heard that one before. Do you think it's the letdown, or just people do their one hitch? We're going to get the other devil dog who got out as Lance Corporal's opinion on it. And some of this is just people grow out of it. They grow up. They don't decide it's not for them.
5% of...
Yeah, I would agree with all of that. Some people just decide it's not for them. Some people joined to only do that one term and get all their benefits. And the reason I think that they want it to be around that 75%, right, is because too many chiefs, not enough Indians, right? You have to have a substantially larger amount of people as the E1 to E5 range than you do in the, senior leadership.
Who we recruited just 4 years ago.
I wanted to be my own boss. I wanted to tell myself when I wake up.
Right.
I want to tell myself when I go to work. I want to tell myself, when
Side note, I do exactly that. I work on what I want, when I want, where I want. Financial freedom's pretty sweet.
I'm off. And I was tired. I was tired of not being able to go home. I was tired of having to ask another grown man, can I go home and see my family?
What we want to do is we want to make sure that we give Marines opportunity who want, number one, to stay in the Marine Corps. Number two, who have the talent and the skills to succeed, continue to succeed in the Marine Corps.
Let's talk about what the young devil dog who just got out, he said he wanted to do his own thing, right? Get up when you want, grow your hair how you want. I heard a lot of guys say that, right? But the reality is when you get out, you're still beholden to somebody, unless you're self-employed. Most people aren't. They're working somewhere. And that young jarhead was in the infantry. So you don't have any skills that transfer. So guess what? You're doing probably a shitty job unless you go to college. I get it. But you're always going to be beholden to somebody. But I did hear that sentiment a lot, even 30 years ago. Let's keep moving.
And they tried. People tried to get me to stay in. They were like, you know what, Cantrell, we'll let you be a recruiter. You can go recruit out of whatever city, whatever town. They even said I can go down to the Pacific recruiting station. That's how bad they wanted me to stay in. And that was after everything had happened to me, after I had been shitted on for having a YouTube channel and trying to bring in people and all this stuff. And now you want me to work for you.
All right, so his story is a common theme. He was a corporal, got busted to Lance Corporal. Take a look at his channel for those details. But you get a lot of guys that feel like the Corps screwing them over, and they get jaded. That's a common theme, and it's a leadership issue. Leadership can say, hey, young devil dog, you screwed up, but we love you. And a lot of times that don't happen.
and then develop a more mature force.
I would agree with that. The Marine Corps talks about, and the military in general, not just the Marine Corps, but talks about, take your punishment and then it's over, right? NJP and done, move on. Unfortunately, as all humans, people are flawed, and so that's not always the case. You get a DUI and then it's like harbored against you for the rest of your career, right? It's not punishment done and move on like it used to be, where you could have multiple NJPs and still function.
What does that mean? Rather than retrain a whole group of new Marines, you keep more of the ones you've trained.
Do not take it the wrong way. I do not hate the Marine Corps. Marine Corps, great gig. I wish I didn't have the experience I did.
So here you go. He's talking about retaining Marines you've trained, right? So this guy had NJP, gets busted, but he sounds like, if you listen to his other videos, he really liked it. He got jaded after getting burned over something that he thought was stupid. And maybe it's just a life lesson. But you got to retain these guys. I had a guy track me down I knew after 30 years in the Marine Corps. I knew at the time I met him as young corporals he was going to be a lifer. That was going to be his thing. And some people love it. But you got to encourage this a little bit, because they're looking outside and going, it may be better if I get out of the Corps. And they realize it's kind of the same shit, just wrapped differently.
I should also mention, he talked about his YouTube channel earlier. I experienced the same thing. As the Military Millionaire platform grew, I actually got dropped a little bit on a fitness report where I had taken on, so I had been number one, and then I had taken on an additional billet and led the logistics to Bridgeport, California, as the logistics chief, which is not my MOS. I'm a motor transport guy. So I took the gun, I was a staff sergeant at the time, young staff sergeant, took the gunny's billet because he was injured and his MOS, and led the charge to Bridgeport for a regiment, and came back, and I had dropped a little bit on from number 1 to like number 2 or 3. Not a huge drop, but when I asked why, the answer was, how could I be as passionate about the Marine Corps if I've got this other thing going on the side? Which is hilarious when you think that most Marines are spending their free time like drinking and playing Call of Duty at home, or going out to clubs or whatever, and I'm spending it running YouTube channels and podcasts trying to help service members and vets, and somehow I'm the one whose personal life is detracting from Marine Corps ability, despite the fact that I had been 111, like the top dog, took on an additional billet, and then I fell to a female who hadn't been on that trip, right? And she's a stud, don't get me wrong. It's not anything about her as a human. It's just, I think the rating system is, that was not the only time or person that I had been scolded or verbally told that what I was doing was detracting from my service, which is hilarious given that if you look at my service record, it is flawless.
Still in the Marine Corps.
You start to retrain, re-educate, advance those skills, get more and more to the perfection of it is in the art of war. What's the advantage? The advantage is that you have a group of Marines now that have got the reps and sets, who are now capable of taking on the responsibilities the Commandant talked about in his planning guidance of, pushing those authorities down to the lowest level possible.
Hurry up and wait. It's up there, and the top things I hate about the Marine Corps is because it's one of those things that wastes so many people's time, and it just shows how unorganized units can be whenever hurry up and waits.
Well, here's the thing. Toxic leadership, you hear that all the time. But shitty leadership can get guys that are going to be lifers when you met them to get out of the Marine Corps after one hit. They're going to go, this sucks. I don't want to do it. What happens a lot of times is you get some gunnery sergeants trying to prove a point. Maybe he's a shitty leader. Or even worse, you get a young officer, right, that wants to prove the point. PT's at 0500. You need to show up at 0400. And eventually you go, okay, I know when to show up. I don't need you to babysit me.
That can only be...
Say it ain't so. And something I think happened over the last decade is that there were people who stayed in, maybe 2 decades, who stayed in because of reenlistment bonuses, retention bonuses, and things like that from Afghanistan, Iraq, and the retention plus up, who probably wouldn't have stayed in otherwise. And so we made it, unfortunately, easy enough to justify staying in, even if you were only staying in because you had nothing better to do on the outside. And I noticed a lot of combat vets getting out when the war stopped, not because they were upset the war stopped, and not because of funding issues, but because all of a sudden the Marine Corps flipped, and it went back to the combat stuff doesn't matter as much as the barracks room inspections, the dress blue inspections, the other things. And so these guys and girls who were combat hardened Marine Corps veterans and really solid leaders were basically told to dial it back and be a little bit more politically correct and no more hazing. And not saying that hazing's good, but no more hazing and no more this and no more that. Dial it back. And they didn't feel like they belonged anymore. That wasn't the Marine Corps they knew. That wasn't exciting. It wasn't adventurous. So they got out. And now the people who are left are the people who didn't have other options or took a big retention bonus because that's why they stayed, and they didn't care as much. They weren't as solid of leadership. And then, and I'm gonna don't make me go down the rabbit hole. Not to say that hazing is good, bad, different, indifferent, whatever, right? Like, I don't think that hazing is the answer, but I think there are pros and cons. I think there's a scale. We went so far to the aversion to hazing that leaders were afraid to put their foot down. They grew more scared of saying no, of being harsh, of like actually disciplining Marines and telling them how it's, how things run, because it became too easy almost for a victim, quote unquote, to make a claim and just trash that person's career, right? Because again, guilty until proven innocent, unfortunately, seems to be kind of a thing in the military. And so I had friends who lost their career or just lost their faith in the Marine Corps over things that either turned out to be false or weren't that big of an issue. Now, are there issues? Absolutely. Do we need to investigate things? Absolutely. However, there needs to be a better method, because unfortunately the Marine Corps is not this nice PC thing where you join and you sing Kumbaya. It is a war machine. And when you get rid of the things that make a war machine go boom and actually be a war machine, the people who run that show best, the leaders, the people that we love, right? The Sergeant Major Castle, the legends in the Marine Corps, those people don't become legends. They get out because they're not fulfilled or accepted anymore, and they have to not be true to who they are. And it's unfortunate. So again, as always, these are all just my opinions, but let's continue.
It's done through experience, and experience is a time factor. It's an individual, are you capable factor, but really in terms of maturing the force, it's about retaining our Marines.
Yeah, that would be...
How do you go about doing that? And there's
God bless his soul, but Sergeant Major Black here, the talking points. If you want to retain guys, right, you talk to people like these two fellas on YouTube, the one guy who's still in, the guy who got out. You talk to veterans sub 5 years out and you say, what could we have done to keep you in? Is there anything? You don't just sit there in some bubble talking to other O's and realize, oh, this is what we need to do. Here's what the marketing data tells us. Now, you may have done that. Don't get me wrong. But you got a pool of people who can give you advice. And some of the same complaints I hear in this video from guys that were fresh out or still in are the same shit I heard when I was in. So it's not getting better.
Follow-on question, right? How do you go about that? Number one, in order to stay in the Marine Corps, you got first want to be a Marine. The number one incentive for recruiters to have someone join the Marine Corps is, do you want to be a Marine? The number one incentive to stay in the Marine Corps is, do you want to be a Marine? That's number one.
I agree that we shouldn't be pushing financial benefits, and we should be keeping the people who actually want to stay a Marine. This actually brings another point to me, home to me, and as you can tell, I'm not the leanest human in the world, right? So I always struggled with height, weight, but I taped out, right? I had never once in the Marine Corps did I fail tape or a fitness test. And so I met the standard, and yet I received hate for years from leadership about my body type, right? So I would even argue that to a degree I have, body dysmorphia? Like, I don't remember the name, but like mental issues surrounding my weight, and have probably screwed up my metabolism through the amounts of hydroxycut and crazy stuff that I used to do, wrestling style, water weight cuts, whatever, to try to make height weight standards in the Marine Corps, despite meeting the body tape standard because of the perception, right? And so unfortunately in the Marine Corps, a lot of times there's this perception of like the fast guy who looks like a Marine is the best. And that's just not always the case, right? You can be really fast and really stupid.
And I almost got to a point where I hated putting on the uniform. I hated the fact that people knew I was a Marine once I went out in town.
I left this clip in because I remember at Camp Pendleton, we did everything we could and we went out in town to not look like jarheads because there was a stereotype. Certain ladies didn't want to mess with jarheads, you know, military area. I'm not sure we hated it for the same reasons as him. My situation was different. I didn't get, you know, the NJP. I could see how that could make you jaded, especially if you're, say, at a Camp Lejeune in a town where it's just the Marine Corps base. There's not a whole lot going on. You want to just slide out off work and just be a normal human, not be classified as the jarhead, the troublemaker, the bar fight guy.
Secondly, it's a whole list of other things, and we can talk about them in a subsequent question, but the onus on retaining the force and why and what's the incentive to do so is to stay a United States Marine.
So what are some of the roadblocks that you're seeing, or why are Marines?
I want you guys to put in the comments what you think the reasons people are getting out of the military in general. The Marine Corps is fine. I want to see if they line up with what the Sergeant Major's telling us. Is he reading off a script? Has he done his homework? I want to believe he has.
Number one on the list is probably quality of life. What does that mean? Quality of life means exactly what it is. You know, the majority of the force is single. The majority of the force live in the barracks. And if the quality of our living conditions isn't where the Marines want it to be.
Fucking Mackey Hall. That barracks in Hawaii is notorious for being a shithole. Like to the point where Dakota Meyer name drops it in his most recent book, right? Dakota Meyer, Medal of Honor recipient, 3rd Marines. Like name drops Mackey Hall. And it hasn't gotten any better. I actually had to show a senator, Tulsi Gabbard, through that barracks at one point, amongst other people, for why it was so terrible as a facilities guy for a little bit before I left Hawaii. And yeah, oh my gosh. You know, I get it's a historical building, but like, damn, the fact that Marines or people still live there, you know, we don't need to have a 5-star hotels for living situations, but if there's places like that the Sergeant Major of the Marine Corps and the Commandant of the Marine Corps are aware of, then we should be able to do something to fix it.
Arguably, where I think it should be, then what's the option? Let me live off the installation.
I heard that statement. I harkened back to the first time I went to March Air Force Base. I went up there, met some people at the E-Club, and they said, you want to go back to our dorm? Next morning was the dining hall. And I realized, wow, I think it's a little different in the Air Force. And so there is a big difference in accommodations. You hear that all the time. Across the services, and the Marine Corps has always had pretty shitty ones.
If we can't do that, we got to make a choice.
As far as infrastructure, we're starting to get better. We're starting to catch up to the other branches in terms of buildings and barracks and everything of those of that nature. The gear that we have, some of the gear that we have is very old, outdated, obsolete. We need to get rid of it.
Let's talk about gear for a second. We had Alice packs, and I remember getting them from Supply. These things were Vietnam-era web gear, Alice packs, the canteens, the whole thing. I'm in boot camp. I'm at the rifle range. I'm trying to hit the target. Can't do it. Instructor comes over and goes, go get another rifle. So yeah, the stuff you get, the equipment, is always the shit. And you really find out it's crappy when you get on other services. And you go, wow, we got really the garbage. We got the lowest level, the redhead stepchild shit of the military.
The better question is, well, how come we're not?
All right, sorry about if you can tell that there's a break here. I had a hour-long call with our new hotel live-in managers to go over some stuff. So now we're continuing again.
We're not pushing that a little harder as far as how we can, maybe work on that. Everything is driven by resources. Everything is driven by resources. I think what you've seen in the Commandant's planning here the last couple of years, and
when you hear everything's driven by resources, like no shit, Sherlock. But if you're having to recycle guys every hitch, so every 4 years, you got to get a new guy to fill that squad leader role or fire team leader. You think, you go, well, maybe it's better for us financially to retain guys than it is to lose guys. That would be common sense in most businesses. Somehow the military, in particular the Marine Corps, doesn't get it because I guess they were churning and burning. Now you got to teach these guys complicated communication systems. Depending on the MOS, could be long schooling. But, this is common sense for any other business in the world.
As we go into the...
Well, I think I agree with most of what this guy's saying, but I think the fundamental difference here is that in most of those businesses, there's not a rank structure and like set guidelines for promotion, right? So if we retained everybody, we couldn't promote everybody, because if you get if you retain an extra 10% of the Marine Corps, right, an extra 20,000 people, and they all become gunnies, like, well, now who do they lead? If, either the force grows because you maintain these people and have to bring in even more lower ranks to maintain, like, rank structure balance, or you make it almost impossible to promote, which doesn't help retention. So it's kind of a weird conundrum they're stuck in between having to stay at a certain force manpower and also still maintain the dynamic of, like, who's, leadership and troops.
The future with how we request our resources, there's a heavy emphasis on that quality of life. I'm speaking about barracks in particular, but it's any number of things I can bring up and follow on questions. But I'd start there. Quality of food in our chow halls, dining facilities. It's a whole different list of questions. Command climate comes up a lot, but what does command climate mean? Command climate does not mean the commander and the senior,
Command climate is the War College word for leadership. How is the leadership? Is it consistent across units? Are we having young lieutenants that are morons coming in? Are we having platoon sergeants that are morons? Are they understanding that we want to retain these guys? Let's not shit on them all the time. This ain't boot camp.
Leaders of the organization. Usually it's, if you're a corporal, it's the sergeant. It's the lieutenant. Not that they're poor quality, but young people leading young people, you asked about maturing the force, you get a dynamic there. Maturing the leadership.
Accountability is very huge in the Marine Corps, but if it takes you 4 hours to get accountability, that just tells you right there that your unit's probably not that good at getting accountability. You know what I'm saying?
So you're going to hear a lot of guys get out because they go leadership, toxic leadership, something of that sort. I had this bright idea a long time ago. How about we make the leaders, the company commanders, the best leaders in a bunch of people? So we just don't take somebody who's got 4 years in the military, OCS, college degree, and now they're the company commander. When you got a gunnery sergeant who may be locked on, great leadership, can read people, understands when to push hard and pull back. We don't do that. That's probably one of the few businesses that you don't move up in management based on merit. If you're enlisted, you stay there. You could be smarter than any dumbass general, but you're going to stay as the senior enlisted guy. Why do we do that? It don't make any sense today.
Leadership only care about the power of being, in that leadership role. Some of them are so power hungry that they think that even outside the Marine Corps, they have the same power. And it's just funny because it's like, man, if we were just regular people, you would be nothing. Like, you know what I'm saying? Like, you would have no power over me.
The number one thing I hate the most in the Marine Corps is mass punishment.
So mass punishment, you get it, happens in boot camp. You're a squad leader. Your squad messes up, you pay. But as you move on, you get outside of training, the mass punishment doesn't make any sense. Because after a while, you're like, I'm not the f*** up here. That guy's the f***. Address him. But let's say a room's dirty at the barracks. All of a sudden, the whole weekend secured. You're cleaning barracks rooms. You're having inspections. That kind of shit gets old. You don't feel like an adult. You're like, I didn't do this. It's not my problem. This guy's an F-up. But they gear a lot of things towards the lowest level moron, and then everybody pays. Stand by.
Yeah, my favorite example of this was in Hawaii. Some people weren't going to medical to get taken off the medical hit list. Therefore, let's do a formation for the entire fucking regiment, and we'll call out everybody's name who's on this fucking hit list and all of their leadership and blah, 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 and march them to medical. Mind you, the real issue was that people were going and they were putting themselves in the logbook and medical wasn't updating their hit list. And we said that. We would even show up. We showed up to a formation with proof, like a receipt for medical saying, I had been here and gotten this shot. And they were still like, nope, you're on the list. You're marching with us. And yeah, it was obscene.
Mass punishment is one of those things I will never understand. However, there is a place for mass punishment. All right, there's a place for those who be like, well, mass punishment is one team, one fight. No, bullshit. It's not no one team, one fight whenever it comes to certain shit that Marines are getting punished for.
Let me give you a couple examples. Guys at Pendleton go down Tijuana, get in trouble. Then all of a sudden, liberty's cured for that unit because a couple morons didn't know how to manage their own shit. That's what he's talking about here. A couple guys go out in town, get DUIs. All of a sudden, there's drinking restrictions at the barracks. We don't need to coddle everybody. I get it to a point 'cause you got a bunch of young guys, testosterone-driven. But it's not good for retention long-term.
That gets after that command climate thing. And lastly, I got to be honest with you, there's always families involved. There's a kind of a saying. You recruit a Marine, you retain a family.
And what the Sergeant Major said there is a maybe. You're talking guys from 0 to 4 years getting out after one hitch. Most of them, if they have a family, it's a small family, 1 or 2 kids. They're already divorced. You know how this goes. But it's not the people who've got the families and they've got a couple kids in different schools. But the Marine Corps is terrible at this, say, compared to the Air Force. A guy can be at a duty station for 10 years at the Air Force. Meanwhile, in the Marine Corps, every 3 or 4 years, you got to move around to move up the ladder, the food chain. What would your recommendations be for the Sergeant Major? Seems like his heart's in the right place, has some good talking points. But some of the complaints from these young devil dogs, the same things I heard when I was in. We're talking 30 plus years ago I heard these things. And we're hearing it today. So what's the answer? What's the fix? Thanks for watching.
I already kind of mentioned the height weight thing. Obviously, we don't want a fat Marine Corps, but just removing the stigma. We have these standards, and yet still there is a 89.99, which is first sergeant major, like stigma that if you have to tape out, you're fat. Even if you make the standard, it's not as good as making the standard a different way. We need to get rid of that. We need to stop pressuring people to do unhealthy things to make weight when it's arbitrary. If you meet the standard, you meet the standard. We need to make it okay for people to have opinions. And I don't mean like political opinions and stuff like that. I mean, like, we've started doing this innovator challenge where young Marines can come up with an innovation. They win some money if they, if it's the innovation of the year that's chosen or whatever. But we need to facilitate that more into everyday life so that a young service member who comes up with a great idea is allowed and given opportunities to broach that idea up to the force, SysCom, Systems Command, or whoever it is that would need to. So like, let's say a guy turning wrenches comes up with a better way to turn wrenches. He can bring it up instead of just being stopped at his unit. Similarly, performance, right? I think there needs to be a way for performance to really matter and stand out. And so, like, let's say you do really well on your fit rep or in a school or whatever, like that stuff should hold weight for promotion. It should be that we promote the best, not necessarily a time and service requirement. So if you've got 5 years worth of sergeants to choose from, maybe there's a way to actually choose the best sergeant for staff sergeant rather than saying only people who've been in this long can be eligible. I don't know what that is. Now, here's the thing. Ineffectiveness actually looks good in the Marine Corps, right? Ironically, when I was reading The 4-Hour Workweek by Tim Ferriss, I realized very quickly that in business, you have to do as much as humanly possible in the shortest amount of time. In W-2 or salary jobs, a lot of times it's how can I get the least amount done without getting fired and still get promoted, right? So let's say you have to do 10 things and you could be done with all 10 things in 2 hours, but then you'll get tasked with 10 more things. So what if you just take the entire 8-hour workday to do those 10 things, because then you get to go home and you still got the 10 things done, right? That's kind of the mentality that's bred. And ironically, like I've been in units before where I was very efficient at stuff and I would get done, get a ton of stuff done real fast. And then I'd be like sitting around and like, hey, it's, almost time to go home. Can I get out of here? You need anything else? And then there were counterparts of mine who were like all over the place, not actually getting any work done. And then at the end of the day, they're like, oh, look, I'm staying late because I got all this stuff to do because I just screwed around all day. And the perception from like leadership is, oh, wow, that guy's staying late. He really cares. He's awesome. Rather than, oh, hey, this guy got all his stuff done and he's ready to go home to his family. And so we need to find a way to kind of get rid of that stigma, right? It should be performance-driven vice time-driven, because just being in the office for a longer period of time does not make you more effective. If anything, it probably makes you less effective, less motivated. And if you're that leader, that's on you, right? Like if you're staying late or changing word last minute or all these things because you can't plan and you can't lead, like, it's like the idea that I forgot to text my Marines about PT, so now I'm changing PT plans at like 10 o'clock at night via text message. Dude, screw you, man. Like, you should have figured out what tomorrow's plan was before we went home, because now it's 10 o'clock at night. I'm drinking and I got to show up for this, right? So now I know people are going to be like, oh, you're just being a bitch. You should be able to PT even after you drink. Look, I've been there, done that. What I'm saying is, regardless of the response of the young service member, the leader has a responsibility to their troops to be able to pass word and tell what the plan for tomorrow is by the end of the day, or acknowledge that if they failed to do so, they need to not change the normal 7:30 or 8 o'clock showtime because it is their fault that they were not able to plan ahead, not the troops, right? Also, and they mentioned something on here, but kind of the joke of like people who stay late at work because they hate their families. That's great. Just because your wife doesn't love you or whatever doesn't mean you keep other people there. So let's see. This is kind of mentioned. I think politics is way too involved in the military right now. We're not allowed to have a political opinion, and yet we're having to do training on pronouns, extremism, which I'll be honest, the extremism class was basically just a bunch of examples on how straight white males were doing terrible things. Not to say that those cases do not exist, but the idea that they're the only people with any kind of extremism, it's bullshit, right? Like, there are extremists on all sides of the aisle, left, right, down the middle. They're just terrible fucking people. But to only signify and showcase one side of the coin because that fits the narrative is stupid. Politics have no place in the military, right? We shouldn't be politically correct. We shouldn't have to worry about all that stuff. We should be a war machine. We should be allowed to be crude, and we should be allowed to not be politically correct. And I'm not saying that we need to be terrible people and just have no rules and no order, right? Obviously, we need all of those things. But we shouldn't have outside forces dictating what jobs men should do and women should do, whether or not we should have people going through gender changes in the military, whether or not pronouns, like pronoun training, like, the fuck out of here. Like, you think he, she, they, them crap helps us win wars? No, we need to filter everything through, does this help us win wars? Does this make us intimidating to the enemy? That's how it should be treated. It's the military, not a social freaking whatever. Annual training, oh my god. Like, my favorite example of how much of a waste some of this stuff is that there is a annual requirement to do an a tobacco cessation training, right? Like, how to quit tobacco. And the first question is like, do you use tobacco? Yes, no. And if you say yes, then you go through the course. And if you say no, then it says, well, maybe you know somebody who could benefit from this, and you still go through the course. Look, dude, if I don't smoke fucking cigarettes, don't make me sit through a 3-hour class or 2-hour class or 1-hour class on why smoking cigarettes is bad. There's so many things like that. Sexual assault class that you get every year. Okay, I got it. It's wrong, but like, the course is so boring. Tattoo classes. I mean, just some of the stuff that we go through. It's like, dude, what is any of this help with? Like, as a leader, it was very hard to figure out, like, how do I get them through all this training and still actually be able to let them, like, shoot guns or train? So we just need to get back to filtering things through the lens of what helps us win wars, what helps us be a formidable foe, and that's what we should focus on. The Marine Corps, the military, is a war machine, not a social experimentation platform, not a touchy-feely woo-woo platform. It's also, I think, the greatest thing you could do out of high school to set yourself up for success. But I've got other videos on that, so I'm not going to ramble. But I don't do a ton of reaction videos, so let me know what you think.